Chapter 12, The New Faith. And you, woman of the people, while caressing the pretty head of the child who nestles close to you, do you never think about the lot that awaits him if the present social conditions are not changed? Count and see how many there are who suffer injustice. Aye, all of us together, we who suffer and are insulted daily. We are a multitude whom no man can number. We are the ocean that can embrace and swallow up all else. When we have but the will to do it, that very moment will justice be done. That very instant the tyrants of the earth shall bite the dust. Bite the dust. Hilda laid aside the book of pamphlets which she had borrowed from Ada Breen that afternoon, and rising from her pillow looked about the room. The clock on the mantelpiece showed 12:15. The child was sound asleep. In the street below there was a noise, but she distinguished it as a song which a couple of drunken men on their way home were singing. Nothing was changed in the 4 hours since she went to bed with the book, and yet nothing was the same again. She wanted to laugh loud and long at her former fears, beliefs, scruples. No, she did not want to laugh after all. What she wanted was to proclaim the new faith that she had found, to announce that she, Hilda Thorson, was no longer what she had been, and she was no longer alone. She had joined the millions of others who walk in darkness. Walk in darkness, yes. That was the phrase one of the writers had used. She had joined the great army of the proletariat. She jumped out of bed, wrapped herself in her kimono, and turning out the light, took up her favorite position near the open window. There were a million stars in the sky, and against these stars the huge tenements about her looked like dismal, tragic carcasses awaiting the cart and the cartman. They were doomed, these tenements. Strange, but they did not know it. The new order had doomed them. The social revolution would sweep them away. Suddenly, she became aware of a commotion. The tenements were stirring. They were falling back, retreating to the ends of the earth. In their place, a garden had arisen. Interspersed through the garden were homes. They were the homes of the new social order. Healthy children, neatly dressed with refined looks in their faces, were playing all about. They were the children of the proletariat in the new age. Hilda became aware that she was dreaming with her eyes wide open, and she smiled at the flights of vision she was yielding herself up to. But the vision brought her a cheerfulness she had never before experienced. A new dignity had come over her. Her suffering, the suffering of millions like herself, had not gone unnoticed. People knew of it. Writers wrote about it. How beautifully they wrote. Want and suffering had become a badge of honor, one of the pamphlets had said. The future belonged to those who suffer. If she only had someone to talk to. Her mind was full to bursting, and her heart ached with feeling, with love for the poor, for the weary and oppressed. But there was no one to talk to. The streets were sound asleep. Sorrow and tears, sin and suffering had found rest in the bosom of the night. She searched the face of the clock. It was 1:15. Time to go to bed. She had to go to work in the morning. But she was not falling asleep, and she began to count. 35, 150, 225. She would try keeping her eyes fixed upon a point on the wall. It had worked once before. Yes, but It could not be possible. Well, it was so. She could hardly speak for emotion. Yes, it was he, Kropotkin himself. He stood before her and was very glad to meet her, Hilda Thorson. He knew her name. Yes, he had meant every word he had said in the pamphlet. She was the equal of anybody. All were equal. There were no high and no low. All were needed for the coming revolution. She was needed. She could do much good. He was introducing her to a host of celebrated people. Karl Marx, Bebel, Liebknecht, they all looked quite familiar. She remembered their names readily. Why shouldn't she? Hadn't she read at length about them in French and German socialism? Raymond had given her the book. Raymond. The memory of him seemed trivial now. He was out of place in the midst of this distinguished company. There was a commotion outside. She ran out to see. She was in Spain, Madrid. In front of the royal palace were masses of workmen. They were displaying their ragged clothes, showing their hollow faces and sunken chests. Crying for bread, freedom. Soldiers were coming, bayonets, terror in the eyes of the men. But wait, women. An army of women was coming. They were sweeping the men aside. They rushed to the front, tearing their waists, shirts, exposing their breasts to the bayonets. The soldiers quailed. Brave women! Hurrah! Long live the revolution! Onward! Onward! The clock was ringing. It was 5:15, morning. Hilda was distantly conscious of a headache. She had not had enough sleep. But she jumped out of bed, went up to the window, and stuck her head out. The morning dew was enveloping her body like a cold sheet. She stood near the window the whole of 5 minutes. Then she began to dress. She hummed softly as she washed. She was impatient to see Mrs. Breen. Would her friend recognize the change which had come over her? There were things about Ada which Hilda had never before fully understood. A certain poise, a certain serene way of looking at people, of meeting life. But now she understood her. Ada was a socialist. That explained everything. She had a viewpoint. She had an ideal. She had a dream. Hilda and Mrs. Breen were scarcely out of the elevator at noon when she asked, "Is that Prince Kropotkin an old man?" "About 70, I should say. Why?" "Nothing. I read his pamphlet last night. Has he written more books?" Ada had several volumes of Kropotkin at home. She had other books, too, that Hilda might like to read. "Come over to my flat some evening this week and look at 'em," she said. As they approached the loft building again on their way from lunch, Hilda asked, "Are there any other socialists in the shop beside ourselves?" There was suppressed agitation in her voice, and Ada looked at her friend closely. "The girl is changing," she mused. "She has changed already." Aloud, she answered, "I believe there are quite a few. There are a number of faces I recall having seen at socialist affairs." Several times in the course of the afternoon, Hilda swept the shop with her gaze. She was searching among the hundreds of workers at the machines, the few souls who shared her faith, the faith of socialism. She was greeting them in her thoughts. Mrs. Breen's home was a nest of memories of her dead husband. In 3 rooms, she crammed most of the furniture of a 5-room apartment. Her husband's books, several hundred of them, stood neatly arranged in bookcases about the walls. His writing table, the ink well filled, stood fresh and dustless, as if she were momentarily expecting him to come in and sit down to write. On the walls were pictures. Karl Marx, Nietzsche, Kropotkin. Hilda liked the real likeness of Kropotkin even better than the one she had conjured up in her dream. There was so much kindness in the man's bearded face and eyes. One small frame contained a sheet of paper written in a broken, uneven scrawl. Hilda read its brief contents. It said, "Dear Ada, not very good today. My eyes are troubling me. Cloudy. Come as soon as you can. Bring Willie along without fail. Leon Breen." "It's my husband's last note from the hospital," Ada explained. "We came to see him that evening, Willie and I, and at midnight he died. He complained of clouds passing before his eyes all the time we were with him." While her friend was busy in the kitchen, Hilda was turning over an album. She came across the photograph of an old woman who bore a striking resemblance to Mrs. Breen. Hilda asked her about the picture. "That," said Ada, "is my mother." "Is she alive?" "Oh, yes. She's right here in New York." "You never speak of her." Ada's face clouded. "No," she said thoughtfully, "I never do. I've grieved my mother in the past, and she hurt me. We now see each other very rarely." "You see," she turned to Hilda after a silence, and there was pain in her eyes, pain and a plea for understanding. "You see, my husband and I never went through the marriage ceremony." Hilda looked puzzled. She did not get the significance of her friend's words. Ada went on explaining to her, telling her things from the beginning. Her parents were Russian immigrants, and they brought her to London when she was 8. She was the youngest in the family and went to school. Her other sisters went to a factory. Her father was the only one who indulged her. He was proud of her, but he died early. She managed to finish her primary education, and then she went to work. When she was 18, Leon Breen took a room with an aunt of hers, and they met. He was a Russian revolutionist, and he began taking her to socialist meetings. Her mother had no understanding for such things, but she trusted Breen. Everyone trusted him, and she, Ada, came and went with him as she pleased. One day, Breen asked her to be his wife. She consented. Her mother and sisters, too, were pleased. Breen went out to look for an apartment. He did not believe in marriage ceremonies. She believed what he believed, and so they went to live together without the sanction and approval of a clergyman, in this case, a rabbi. Her mother and sisters were scandalized. To them, free love was a synonym for immorality, and Ada, in their eyes, was not a wife, but a paramour. Dire things would happen to her, they predicted. When her son Willie came, they looked upon him as an illegitimate child. "At first," Ada continued, "my husband tried to enlighten them. But there are things you can't argue into the old generation. My mother wouldn't listen to his words. She felt keenly the disgrace of our unmarried state, as she called it. She conceived the idea that she bore the responsibility for my action. She had not brought me up properly. I had lost my father too young, and she should have given me more attention. The feeling of guilt and her inability to rectify things made her all the more bitter toward me. Then my mother and sisters went to America, and we did not see them for a number of years. When we came to New York, my husband again made an effort at reconciliation, but my mother remained obdurate. She was ashamed of me. She looked upon my child as upon something unclean. We saw one another seldom thereafter. Imagine, Mrs. Breen's voice faltered. 2 days before my husband died, Mother sent an aged Jew, the sexton of her synagogue, to the hospital to see my husband and ask him if he would not go through the marriage ceremony with me. My husband forced a smile to his dying lips and said, "If Ada wishes it." The man then came dashing up to my flat and with elated voice told me that my husband had consented to marry me. Wouldn't I hurry to the hospital with him to have the ceremony performed? I've never insulted anyone in my life, but I lost my temper that time and told him to go as fast as he could or I would shoot. He went, and you should have heard what he said about me later. According to the man's description, I was the queen of a band of desperados. The walls of my apartment were covered with daggers and revolvers. Of course, I never held a gun in my hand. Willie had come up from the street. They all went into the parlor, and he took down his violin. He played. Ada Breen was explaining to her in a low voice the nature of the pieces her son was playing, how advanced they were. But Hilda was only half listening and scarcely understood her. She was gazing at Willie. The boy's face, his head, his whole being was in strange communion with the violin. It seemed to her that he was not playing at all, that he was grieving, sorrowing, pouring out a sad tale. And the violin understood him, shared his grief, and vibrated with a subdued sobbing. Was the boy thinking of his father? Hilda wondered. Was he lamenting his parents' untimely death? Was it the story of his own hard and lonely life he was breathing into the instrument? Little Raymond was asleep in the next room, and her gaze wandered in that direction. Her son, too, would have no father, had in fact known no father. Would he miss him? Had he been missing him already? Mrs. Breen, though accustomed to her son's playing and minor moods, also yielded to the spell. A wave of melancholy swept over her. She began enlarging to Hilda on Willie's qualities. He was as good in school as he was in his music. His teachers could not praise him too highly. And at home, he was a regular housekeeper. He was helping her with her work. He even cooked their meals. Willie had finished playing, came up to his mother and put his arm about her shoulders. It was as if he feared the music might have stirred too many sad thoughts in her, and he came to console her. Hilda walked over to the bookcase and studied the titles of some of the volumes. "Do you read much?" she asked. "Oh, yes," Mrs. Breen replied. "It's the only thing that keeps one from becoming despondent, that keeps one's hopes green and one's thoughts beautiful. Isn't it, son?" She raised her arm and took Willie's hand, which was resting on her shoulder, in her own, caressing it softly. Hilda looked at them. She never afterward forgot the picture mother and son made at that moment. At the end of 10 days, a letter came from Mr. Reboff saying that Hilda had been admitted to the Union. The next meeting was to be held on a Thursday, and he hoped to see her there. She went to the meeting with Ada, while Willie stayed at her home with little Raymond. Mrs. Breen was acquainted with the leaders of the Union, and Hilda was introduced to them. There were a number of speeches made about the workers' mission, struggle, People in the audience rose and approved or took issue with the speakers. Hilda listened and experienced a sensation akin to the one she felt on her first school day. All the men and women in the audience seemed to know so much more than she. They hurled back and forth terms which were strange to her. They cited names of men, labor leaders, socialists who figured much in the newspapers. They quoted books, authorities in America, in England, in Germany. There was so much she must learn, so much. It seemed to her as if a great procession was forming. She was to be in it, but was not ready. There were certain things that had to be done quickly, hurriedly. There were losses to cover, deficiencies to make up. Her education did not reach far enough. A feeling of haste came over her. She must hasten, hasten. In the next 2 months, she ransacked Mrs. Breen's bookshelves for socialist tracts and appeals and spent half her nights poring over them. She read both quickly and intensely. She was determined to retain as much as she possibly could of the thoughts and the ideas the booklets contained. She was astonished how simple the ideas these pamphlets put forward were, how just socialism, the new social order, these tracts were advocating seemed to be a proposition of arithmetic and common sense. One pamphlet in particular impressed her. It was an exposition of the place woman would hold in the new order of society. Love, this writer said, would be the only basis for marriage. There would be no young girls marrying old men because they were rich. There would be no classes, no castes, no privileged individuals. Education would be the heritage of all. The schools would be open to all comers. Had this order of society been here already, Hilda mused, she and Raymond would not be apart. They loved each other. They had every right to each other, naturally, normally. It was the Everett money that separated them. Money and false notions, false divisions in society. Henry Everett had ambitions to be counted, to have his son counted among the privileged and the mighty. Another pamphlet was eloquent on the subject of children. In the ideal society of the future, ignorance would not be the excuse, nor gain the motive for children coming into the world. Children would neither be a burden, nor would they be looked upon as a sort of old age pension. Every one would be assured of a decent existence until his or her dying day. Love and love only would be the high priest at every birth. Nothing was said directly in such pamphlets about women like herself, about unmarried mothers. Hilda found no specific mention of illegitimacy except a general statement that all of the present-day injustices against women and discriminations against children would have no place in the new society, would be scrapped with the old order. Several times she was on the verge of asking Ada about this. Perhaps she had a pamphlet on the subject, but she restrained herself on reflection. She and Ada were very dear friends. But there were things in one's personal life that even one's dearest friends had better not know, she mused. They were too private, too intimate. The world seemed to be granting her ungrudgingly the status of a widow, of an honest-to-goodness widow. Time and tide were rolling the episode with Raymond further and further away. Why bring it back? The tragedy of her life was beginning to smolder. Why stir it up again? Work in the factory had become mechanical by now, and the material under her fingers often seemed to transform itself before her eyes into pages, pages, pages. As she fed the cloth to the machine, she was rereading in her mind what she had read in the book the night before. Ada watched with amazed astonishment the rapidity with which her young friend absorbed facts, ideas, theories. The intensity of these 2 months was having its effect upon Hilda's health. A pallor had come into her face. She was exhausting herself by her lack of sleep. Ada again and again warned her to look after her health, but Hilda would not listen. She could see nothing the matter with herself. She was completely under the spell of the books and pamphlets she was devouring. The whole world was one family to her now. All men were brothers, if they only knew it. Yes, if they only knew it. How much pain they could spare themselves, how much suffering, how beautiful the world could be made, if they only knew it. The last Sunday in September, they went to Bronx Park. It had been raining for 2 weeks steadily, and it looked as though the rain would never end. But the weather had cleared, a warm sun had come out, and the slums and tenements of New York seemed to have poured themselves into the park. Men of all races and nations trailed through the grounds with their wives, their children, their baby carriages. The riffraff of the city was here too. Young hoodlums and pickpockets were circulating among the crowds, making noise, annoying, provoking people. Hilda gazed at the crowds, and an immense love rose in her heart. She loved them, the young and the old, the fair and the ugly, the unoffending and the criminal. They were all brothers, her brothers. Their sins and burdens were not of their own making. They were as good as the best. Socialism would make them so. Those who are last shall be first, one socialist writer had put it. She was filled with intense longing for the new social order. But according even to the most optimistic writers, socialism would come only slowly, gradually. How soon before it would come? She shared her thought with Mrs. Breen. In 100 years, I should say, the latter said after reflecting some moments. It ought to take at least that long to clear the earth of its disfigurements. It will be not only capitalism and capitalist institutions socialism will have to fight and destroy, it will have to overcome the beast in man as well. And that will be no easy matter. There is a good deal of beastliness in the world still. In 100 years? Hilda repeated, her eyes shining. In 100 years? That's not much in the progress of mankind. In the history of civilization, Ada's tone was slightly argumentative. Hilda did not answer her. She stretched herself upon the grass, laid her face on her folded arms, and was convulsed with sobs. In 100 years. She would be dead. Her son would be dead. They would live and die in the filth and agony of a rotting civilization. There would be nothing left of their dreams, no one to record their suffering. Mrs. Breen divined her friend's thoughts and waited. When Hilda recovered her composure, Ada smiled to her. It's too bad, she said, that you are such a poor Christian and that I'm not even that. We are both of us excellent subjects for some quiet, out-of-the-way monastery right now. Vanity of vanities. Hilda, too, attempted to smile, but did not go far with it. No, Ada's aspect became serious. We must have a change of diet, little sister. No more pamphlets for a while. I have a set of Turgenev at home. We must start you on that tonight. But books are not all. How long is it since you went to a dance? I shouldn't be surprised if you had not been to a dance in 2 years. I haven't been to one longer than that myself. Hilda, you and I are going to dance this winter.